The rain fell in sheets against the tall windows of Clarence House, blurring the London skyline into a watercolor of gray. For the young royal guard, standing at attention in the corridor outside the Queen Consort's private chambers, the sound was a monotonous drumming that marked the slow passage of his first week on this particular detail. He was newly transferred from the ceremonial duties at Horse Guards, his boots still gleaming with the pride of someone not yet accustomed to the profound silence that filled the royal residences after hours. The opulence around him was a stark contrast to the barracks he called home. Gilt-framed oil paintings of ancestors he didn't recognize lined the walls, and the carpet beneath his feet was so thick it seemed to swallow the sound of his own breathing. His orders for the evening were simple and, unto his mind, peculiar. He was to assist a senior member of the Queen Consort's personal staff in retrieving a selection of garments. A special event was on the horizon, a gala dinner for a charity Camilla held close to her heart, and she had requested a specific dress from the depths of her wardrobe. The guard, whose name was Davies, had been instructed to provide an extra pair of hands and, more importantly, to ensure the security of the corridor during the process. He had expected a simple task: stand by the door while a well-dressed lady's maid did the work. He was wrong. The door to the wardrobe suite was ajar, and a sliver of warm light cut across the dark hallway. He could hear movement inside, the soft rustle of garments and the muffled curse of someone struggling with a stubborn hanger. Then a voice, detinged with frustration and the refined accent of a long-serving royal dresser, called out into the hallway. "Is anyone there? Guardsman? I'm going to need that extra pair of hands now." Davies straightened his spine, took a breath, and stepped inside. The room was not a closet, but a large, climate-controlled antechamber leading to a main vault. Racks of dresses, organized by color and occasion, stood in silent rows. Shoe cubbies, each holding a pair of pristine heels, lined one wall. The dresser, a woman named Margaret who had served the royal household for over 40 years, stood before a massive, ornate wardrobe door that dominated the far wall. This, Davies instinctively knew, was not for everyday wear. It was a secure, free-standing piece of furniture, dark wood with the royal cipher subtly inlaid. I need you to hold the door steady," Margaret instructed, not unkindly. "These old hinges can be tricky, and the last thing we need is for it to slam and upset Her Majesty's entire collection." Davies nodded, stepping forward and grasping the cool brass handle. As Margaret worked a small key in the lock, Davies felt a tremor of history beneath his fingers. He was a history buff, a young man who had joined the army because he loved the tradition and the pomp. The click of the lock was like the turning of a page in a dusty old history book. Margaret pulled the heavy door open, and Davies held it firm. Inside, the wardrobe was a cathedral of fabric. Gowns of silk and velvet hung in protective garment bags, their shapes hinting at the grand occasions they had adorned. Margaret reached past the modern pieces, her hand searching for something at the very back. "It should be right here, in its acid-free bag. She wore it to the Guildhall banquet in 12, I think. There it is." But as she pulled the garment bag forward, it snagged on something. She tugged gently then, with more force. The bag moved, but it brought with it a cascade of protective tissue paper and a heavy, unfamiliar weight from a lower shelf that had been hidden behind a row of hat boxes. Margaret gasped, not in alarm, but in pure, unadulterated surprise. "Oh, my word," she whispered, her hands immediately flying to her mouth. Davies peered over her shoulder, his military discipline momentarily forgotten. There, crumpled in a heap, where it had clearly been stored and forgotten for decades, was a vast expanse of crimson velvet. Even in the dim light of the wardrobe, its richness was undeniable. It was edged with a border of white ermine, each small black tail a marker of a bygone era of royal ceremony. It wasn't a dress. It was a robe of state, heavy and majestic, its fabric stiff with age and the gold embroidery catching the light like distant stars. Margaret knelt down, her professional instincts overriding her shock. She gently lifted a corner of the robe, her trained fingers feeling the weight of the velvet and the delicate condition of the fur. This is the robe of state, she breathed, her voice trembling with a mix of awe and horror at its condition. This is Queen Elizabeth's coronation robe from 1953. What on earth is it doing in here? The air in the room changed. It was no longer just a wardrobe. It was an archaeological dig. The robe, a garment that had been part of one of the most significant moments of the 20th century, the crowning of a young queen who would become the longest reigning monarch in British history, lay forgotten on a shelf in her daughter-in-law's closet. For a moment, neither of them moved. They were just two people, a dresser and a guard, holding a piece of history that had been accidentally rediscovered. The dress for the gala was momentarily irrelevant. The silence in the room was now heavy with the weight of 70 years, and the unspoken question hung in the air. What happened next? And what would the queen consort say? Margaret's hands hovered over the crumpled velvet as if she were a bomb disposal expert facing a live explosive. She didn't dare move it further without a plan. And her 40 years of service had taught her the protocol for everything: how to pack for a royal tour, how to clean a diamond tiara, how to press a military uniform, but there was no manual for finding a lost coronation robe in the back of a wardrobe. "We can't just shove it back in," she said, more to herself than to the young guardsman still frozen by the door. "And we certainly can't leave it like this." The velvet was crushed under its own weight, the delicate gold embroidery on the train. Wheat ears, symbolizing plenty, and olive branches for peace. Strained and distorted by decades of improper storage. A layer of fine dust, the kind that settles over years in forgotten spaces, dulled the sheen of the crimson fabric. Margaret made a swift decision. "Guardsman Davies, I need you to go to my workroom. At the end of the hall, turn left. It's the door with the brass knob. On my table there's a large, clean, white cotton sheet. Bring it to me, quickly and quietly." Davies nodded and slipped out, his heart pounding with a sense of clandestine purpose. While he was gone, Margaret pulled out her phone. She didn't call a curator at the palace or a member of the royal household staff. She called the one person who would understand the gravity and the intimacy of the find, the queen consort's private secretary. The conversation was hushed and brief. "We've found something unexpected," Margaret murmured into the phone. "It's the late queen's coronation robe. It's here, in the wardrobe." There was a pause on the other end, a silence that spoke volumes. The secretary, a woman who had seen it all, was momentarily speechless. Her instructions were clear: secure the item, and tell no one else, and await further direction. The queen consort would need to be informed, but not tonight. This required the right moment, the right context. Davies returned with the sheet, and together with the reverence of pallbearers, they worked to create a temporary cradle. They carefully lifted the heavy robe, its weight surprising them both, over 15 pounds of silk velvet and ermine. They laid it out on the clean sheet, folding it gently into wide, loose pleats that wouldn't stress the fabric further. As they lifted it, a faint, almost imperceptible scent drifted up from the garment, a ghost of old-fashioned face powder, the faintest trace of a long-gone perfume, and the unique, clean smell of the 1950s. For a second, Margaret closed her eyes. She had been a young girl in 1953, watching the coronation on a tiny black-and-white television. She remembered the excitement, the national pride, the image of a slender, dark-haired young woman walking down the aisle of Westminster Abbey in this very robe. Now here it was, in her hands, vulnerable and forgotten. They placed the shrouded robe on a chaise lounge in the corner of the room, a temporary, respectful resting place far from the dusty shelf where it had languished. Margaret then returned her attention to the wardrobe, her curiosity now fully ignited. She shone a small torch into the dark recesses of the shelf where the robe had been found. There, wedged behind where the robe had sat, was a flat, archival-looking box. It wasn't marked with any modern inventory sticker. It was simply made of stiff, cream-colored cardboard, aged to a mottled brown. As with Davis's help, they carefully extracted the box. It was lighter than the robe, but felt equally significant. Margaret lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded tissue paper, lay a delicate piece of embroidery. It was a small, intricately worked panel of silver and gold thread depicting a bouquet of flowers. Margaret didn't recognize the specific flowers, but she recognized the craftsmanship. It was of the same quality as the work on the robe. This was no random piece of needlework. This was a spare, or a practice piece, or perhaps a detail that had been designed for the robe but never used. It was a ghost of the creative process, a fragment of the 3,500 hours of labor that 12 women had poured into the original garment in the months leading up to the coronation. As she held it, the story became more complex. This wasn't just a forgotten robe, it was a time capsule. How had it ended up here in Camilla's wardrobe decades later? The question that had started as a simple what was rapidly becoming a much more intriguing why. The discovery was no longer just a cleaning task. It was a mystery wrapped in velvet, waiting to be solved. The news of the discovery was delivered to Camilla not in the grandeur of a palace drawing room, but in the quiet intimacy of her private sitting room the following morning. She was dressed simply, a cup of tea cooling in her hands, when her private secretary gently broke the silence. The initial reaction was not one of surprise, but of a deep, contemplative stillness. Camilla set down her cup and listened without interruption. When the story was finished, she simply asked to see it. But later that day, Camilla stood before the chaise lounge where the robe now lay, still draped in its protective sheet. Margaret was there, along with a senior conservator hastily summoned from the royal collection. The conservator, a woman named Eleanor, had gone pale when she received the call. Now, she carefully pulled back the cotton sheet to reveal the full glory and the full neglect of the robe. Camilla's gaze was not one of shock, but of recognition. She reached out a hand, then stopped, looking at Eleanor for permission. The conservator nodded. Camilla's fingers gently touched the ermine trim, feeling the softness of the fur that had been a point of such pride in 1953. Her expression was unreadable, a mask of royal composure. But those closest to her could see a flicker of something profound in her eyes. A sense of connection, of responsibility, of history literally at her fingertips. "It was my mother-in-law's," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. It was a simple statement, but it carried the weight of a complicated relationship with the late Queen, with the institution, and with her own path into this family. Eleanor began her preliminary assessment, speaking in the calm, precise tones of her profession. "The velvet has sustained compression damage," she explained, indicating the permanent creases where the fabric had folded under its own weight. "The gold work is surprisingly robust, but it will need a microscopic inspection for any broken threads or lifted beads. The ermine is the biggest concern. It's a natural material. It can become brittle and attract pests if not stored correctly. The fact it survived this long in a dry environment is fortunate. A damp wardrobe would have destroyed it. She gently lifted the robe to examine the train. The length is significant, over 6.5 meters. It's a wonder it was all in there. As she moved the fabric, a small folded piece of paper, yellowed with age, fluttered to the floor. Davies, still on duty nearby, instinctively bent to pick it up, handing it to Camilla. It was a handwritten note, the ink faded to a sepia brown. The handwriting was elegant, slanting, and unmistakably old-fashioned. It was addressed to Lilibet. Camilla's breath caught. The note was from Queen Mary, the late Queen's grandmother. It was a simple, loving message of pride and blessing on the morning of the coronation. "Wear this, with the strength of your line and the grace of your heart," the note read. "As your loving grandmama." This transformed the discovery entirely. It was no longer just a piece of regalia. It was a personal heirloom. A letter from a grandmother to a granddaughter on the most important day of her life. It was a piece of family history that had been separated from the robe and, presumably, forgotten when the garment was put into storage. For Camilla, the note was a revelation. It humanized the immense, awe-inspiring figure of the late Queen, revealing a young woman who had received a handwritten note of love from her own grandmother. It bridged the gap between the distant monarch and the family she had led. A decision had to be made. The robe could not stay here. It had to be properly conserved. But what then? Return it to the Royal Collection archives, where it would join countless other historical garments? Or did this rediscovery have a different purpose, a more public fate? As Camilla stood there, holding the fragile note from a queen to a future queen, the outlines of a profound tribute began to form in her mind. The following year, the nation would gather for another coronation, the crowning of her husband, King Charles III. It would be a day of continuity and change, and as the queen consort, she would have a central role. The thought, at first just a whisper of an idea, grew louder. Perhaps the forgotten robe, this relic of 1953 carrying a grandmother's blessing, was not meant to stay in the dark. Perhaps it was meant to be seen once more, to physically link the two reigns, to wrap the new king's wife in the tangible history of his mother. The morning of May 6th, 2023, dawned gray over London, but the streets were already a river of color and anticipation. Inside Buckingham Palace, the air crackled with a different kind of energy. For Camilla, the moments before the procession to Westminster Abbey were a study in controlled calm. She stood before a full-length mirror, not as a nervous bride, but as a woman on the cusp of making history, her path to this moment marked by decades of public scrutiny and personal resilience. By her side stood Angela Kelly and the team from E-Day and Ravenscroft, the historic tailors who had conserved the remarkable garment. The process of dressing the queen consort was a choreographed ritual. First came the ivory silk coronation dress, designed by Bruce Oldfield. Its embroidery was a secret garden of personal meaning, featuring daisy chains, forget-me-nots, and, in a deeply sentimental touch, at the silhouettes of her two beloved Jack Russell rescue dogs, Bluebell and Beth, embroidered in gold thread at the hem. The cuffs bore the floral emblems of the four nations of the United Kingdom, but all eyes in the room were on the final piece. The team lifted the crimson velvet robe of state. The weeks of meticulous conservation work had paid off. The velvet had been gently steamed to release the compression damage. The gold embroidery had been carefully cleaned, restoring its luster. The ermine had been inspected and stabilized, its condition far better than initially feared. It was as close as possible to the garment that had processed down the aisle of the Abbey 70 years prior. As the heavy robe was settled onto her shoulders, Camilla felt its weight, not just the physical 15 pounds of silk and fur, but the symbolic weight of the moment. She was wearing the same garment that a 27-year-old Queen Elizabeth II had worn at the dawn of her reign. She was connecting herself and her husband's coronation directly to the legacy of the late Queen. The rediscovered note from Queen Mary was safely displayed elsewhere, its sentiment woven into the day's narrative. As she processed through the palace and into the Diamond Jubilee state coach, the crowds caught their first glimpse. The crimson robe was a shock of brilliant color, a majestic echo of the past. Cameras flashed, capturing the historic detail. For the millions watching at home, the commentary soon explained the significance. The Queen Consort was wearing the late Queen's robe, a gesture of profound respect and continuity. Inside the Abbey, the service unfolded with its ancient, solemn grandeur. Camilla, in her crimson robe, took her place in history. Later in the ceremony, she would change into a new, purple robe of estate, embroidered with bees, beetles, and a personal cipher, symbolizing her own unique role and her love for the natural world alongside the king. But it was the entrance, the first vision of the new queen in the robe of the old queen, that captured the world's imagination. For Guardsman Davies, watching the broadcast from the barracks common room, the moment was surreal. He saw the robe on his television screen, gleaming under the Abbey's lights, and he was transported back to that rainy night in the wardrobe, to the shock of its discovery and the weight of history he had felt in his own hands. He knew the secret story behind the public spectacle. And for Camilla, as she walked slowly back up the aisle after the crowning, the train of the crimson robe held by her attendants, she carried more than just fabric. She carried the memory of the woman who had worn it before her. In that simple, powerful act of wearing the late Queen's robe, Camilla had done more than any speech or statement could achieve. She had silently and majestically woven herself into the fabric of the monarchy, honoring the past while stepping firmly into the future. The robe, once forgotten in the dark, had found its way back into the light, becoming the most poignant and unforgettable detail of a new royal era.